Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden behind the walls of old properties? What if the walls in your home were concealing something far more sinister than just pipes and insulation? Before continuing with this disturbing account from 1905, I need you to comment below where you're watching from. Our channel depends on your support to continue bringing these hidden historical horrors to light, so please subscribe if you haven't already. The small town of Elmwood in the rolling hills of West Virginia was known for its apple orchards that stretched across the landscape like a patchwork quilt. The Blackwood Estate, located on the outskirts of town, boasted one of the most productive orchards in the county, with trees that yielded the sweetest fruit every autumn. James Blackwood, a widower in his 50s, was a respected figure in the community, a church elder, businessman, and orchard owner who employed many of the townspeople during harvest season. In the spring of 1905, when the apple blossoms were just beginning to form on the trees, a young man named Thomas Miller arrived in Elmwood seeking employment. Thomas, 22 years old with weathered hands that spoke of hard labor, had traveled from Pennsylvania following rumors of work opportunities in the orchards of West Virginia. He secured a position at the Blackwood Estate, where James Blackwood had recently undertaken an expansion of his property, adding new sections to the orchard and renovating the stone walls that enclosed the grounds. Mr. Blackwood seemed pleased to have another pair of hands, Thomas would later testify. He assigned me to work with the masonry crew reinforcing the north wall of the orchard. The wall had been there for decades, he said, but needed strengthening to protect the new saplings he'd planted that spring. For 3 weeks, Thomas worked alongside the other laborers, mixing mortar and laying bricks under the warming spring sun. The north wall, unlike the others surrounding the orchard, was unusually thick, nearly 3 feet in some sections, and featured an odd architectural quirk, a recessed section approximately 8 feet wide that seemed to serve no purpose. When Thomas inquired about this anomaly, the foreman, a gruff man named Samuel Hayes, who had worked for the Blackwood family for over 15 years, dismissed the question. "That's just how the old wall was built," Hayes reportedly told him. "Mr. Blackwood wants it preserved exactly as it was, for historical reasons. Just reinforce it and don't ask questions." Thomas might have forgotten about the matter entirely, if not for what happened on the morning of April 23rd. The day began like any other, with the workers arriving at dawn to begin their tasks. Thomas was assigned to continue work on the north wall, specifically the recessed section that had piqued his curiosity. As he began removing some of the older, crumbling bricks to replace them with new ones, he noticed something unusual. A faint, sweet smell emanating from behind the wall. "At first, I thought it might be apple blossoms," Thomas later wrote in his journal. "But this was different, sickly sweet, like fruit left too long in the cellar, and there was something else beneath it, something that made my stomach turn." Curious and increasingly unsettled, Thomas carefully removed more bricks, creating a small opening in the wall. The smell grew stronger. Using the dim light that filtered through the hole, he peered inside. What he saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. There were 2 figures, he would later tell authorities, his voice barely above a whisper, sitting upright, side by side, a woman and a girl. Their clothes were old, rotted. Their faces, I couldn't see their faces clearly, thank God, but they were holding hands. Thomas stumbled back from the wall, dropping his tools with a clatter that drew the attention of nearby workers. Within minutes, work on the orchard wall had ceased entirely as men gathered around the hole Thomas had created. Samuel Hayes pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face draining of color as he looked inside. "Get back to work, all of you," he ordered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "I'll inform Mr. Blackwood." But it was too late to contain the discovery. One of the younger workers had already fled toward town to alert the sheriff. By midday, Sheriff William Porter had arrived at the Blackwood Estate with his deputy and the town doctor, Edward Bennett. James Blackwood met them at the entrance to the orchard, his expression unreadable. "This is a terrible mistake," Blackwood was heard saying. "A terrible misunderstanding." The sheriff ordered the workers to carefully dismantle the section of wall. As the bricks came down, the horrific tableau was revealed in its entirety. Seated on a stone bench inside a small enclosed space were the remains of a woman, approximately 30 years of age, and a girl of perhaps 8 or 9. They were remarkably preserved. Their skin dried and leathery but intact, their clothing faded but recognizable as the style worn some 20 years earlier. The condition of the bodies suggests they were sealed in there alive. Dr. Bennett would later write in his official report, "The space was airtight once bricked up, creating conditions similar to mummification. From the position of the bodies, the mother's arm around the child's head resting against her mother's shoulder, it appears they died of asphyxiation or dehydration. The mother appears to have stayed conscious long enough to comfort her child in their final moments." The most disturbing detail, noted by several witnesses, was that the woman and child were indeed holding hands, their fingers intertwined in a final gesture of comfort or farewell. News of the grisly discovery spread quickly through Elmwood and neighboring communities. Sheriff Porter immediately took James Blackwood into custody for questioning, though no formal charges were filed at that time. The remains were carefully removed and taken to Dr. Bennett's office for further examination, while investigators began the process of identifying the victims. It didn't take long for speculation to begin. Older residents of Elmwood recalled that James Blackwood had been married to a woman named Eleanor, who had a daughter from a previous marriage named Catherine. Eleanor and Catherine had supposedly left Elmwood in the summer of 1885, some 20 years earlier, after Eleanor and James had a series of increasingly public arguments. "I remember Eleanor," said Martha Wilson, who had worked as a maid in the Blackwood household. "A quiet woman, but kind. She doted on her daughter. The girl was a sweet child, always singing. Mr. Blackwood seemed fond of them both at first, but then things changed. He became stricter with the girl, harsher. Eleanor would defend her daughter, and they would argue. Then one day, he told everyone they had gone back east to stay with Eleanor's sister. No one questioned it. When confronted with these recollections, James Blackwood maintained that his wife and stepdaughter had indeed left Elmwood of their own volition. He produced letters, supposedly from Eleanor, postmarked from Baltimore over the course of several years following their departure. But as investigators would soon discover, these letters were forgeries, written in Blackwood's own hand. The investigation took a darker turn when the remains were positively identified as Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood through dental records and personal effects found within the walled chamber. A locket containing a miniature portrait of Eleanor was found around Catherine's neck, and Eleanor was still wearing her wedding ring. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a small journal, remarkably preserved within a tin box that had been placed between mother and daughter. The journal belonged to Eleanor and contained entries dating up to what appeared to be their final days. April 3rd, 1885. James discovered Catherine practicing her mother's faith again today. He was furious, destroyed her small altar. When I intervened, he struck me for the first time. "I have decided we must leave, return to my family in Baltimore. I have begun packing our essentials in secret." April 5th, 1885. James has become suspicious. Today he questioned Catherine about the missing items from her room. "The poor child nearly revealed our plans. I must accelerate our departure. We will leave tomorrow night while he is at the elder meeting." April 6th, 1885. Disaster. James found our packed bags. He was like a man possessed. He has locked us in the root cellar. Says we need time to reconsider our commitment to this family. Catherine is frightened, but trying to be brave for my sake. The final entry, dated April 10th, 1885, was written in an increasingly shaky hand. "We have been moved to a small space behind the orchard wall. James has gone mad. He claims if we wish to leave him, we will never be seen again. He brings us water, but little food. Catherine does not understand why her father is doing this. I have not the heart to tell her he is not her father by blood. The air grows stale when he seals the opening. I fear he does not intend to release us. I write this in hope that someday someone will know what happened here. Catherine is sleeping now. I pray she remains asleep when the air runs out. As the investigation proceeded, more evidence of James Blackwood's deception came to light. Records showed that shortly after the disappearance of his wife and stepdaughter, he had commissioned the expansion of the orchard wall, personally overseeing the work on the north section. The wall had been completed by late summer of 1885, and Blackwood had specifically instructed that the recessed section never be disturbed. "He told us it was a memorial to his departed wife," said Harold Green, who had worked on the original wall. "Said she loved the orchard, and he wanted a special place to remember her by. None of us thought to question it. He was a respected man, after all." The case against James Blackwood seemed insurmountable, but the most damning evidence came from the man himself. After 3 days of questioning, during which he maintained his innocence, Blackwood finally broke down and confessed. According to Sheriff Porter's official report, the accused admitted to imprisoning his wife and stepdaughter in a prepared chamber within the orchard wall after discovering their plans to leave him. He cited religious differences, his wife's adherence to certain old country practices he deemed pagan, and his fear of public humiliation as his motives. He claims he initially intended to release them after they had learned their lesson, but lost his nerve as days passed, realizing the consequences of his actions. Instead, he sealed the wall completely and fabricated the story of their departure. The case of the Orchard Wall murders, as they came to be known, shocked the community of Elmwood and made headlines across the state. James Blackwood was charged with 2 counts of murder and stood trial in the summer of 1905. The trial was brief, the evidence overwhelming. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. However, justice would not be served in the conventional sense. 3 days before his scheduled execution, James Blackwood was found dead in his cell, having apparently taken his own life using strips torn from his bedsheets. He left behind a rambling confession that offered little additional insight into his crimes, but expressed what some interpreted as genuine remorse. "I hear them at night," he wrote, "Eleanor singing to Catherine as she did when they lived. The sound comes from the orchard, from the wall. They are waiting for me." The remains of Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood were given a proper burial in the Elmwood Cemetery, their grave marked with a stone angel that, according to local legend, sometimes appears to weep on the anniversary of their discovery. The Blackwood estate was sold, the orchard eventually replanted with new trees that some claimed never bore fruit as sweet as those that had come before. The story might have ended there, a tragic tale of possessiveness and cruelty, if not for what happened in the decades that followed. In 1925, 20 years after the discovery of Eleanor and Catherine, the new owners of the property, the Harrison family, began to report strange occurrences in and around the orchard. The sounds of a woman singing softly and a child laughing were heard near the rebuilt north wall. Workers refused to stay after dusk, claiming to have seen the figures of a woman and child walking hand in hand among the apple trees. Sarah Harrison, who was approximately the same age Catherine Blackwood would have been when she died, became particularly affected by the phenomena. She began to speak of the lady and the little girl who visited her at night, telling her stories of being trapped and unable to breathe. "They just want someone to remember them," Sarah told her concerned parents. "They say as long as we remember, they won't be trapped anymore." The Harrison family eventually abandoned the property in 1930, unable to cope with the ongoing disturbances. The house remained empty for several years, the orchard untended and overgrown. In 1942, a developer purchased the land with plans to clear the orchard and build several homes. When workers began to demolish the remains of the north wall, 3 men suffered inexplicable accidents on the same day. one falling from a scaffold, another struck by a falling branch that witnesses claimed moved on its own, and the third experiencing temporary blindness after claiming to see a woman's face in the wall screaming silently. The development was abandoned, and the property changed hands several more times over the following decades. Each owner reported similar experiences: singing in the orchard, the laughter of a child, the overwhelming scent of apple blossoms even in winter, and always, always, a sense of being watched from behind the rebuilt north wall. In 1978, the Historical Society of Elmwood purchased the property with the intention of preserving it as a local landmark. During the restoration of the house, workers discovered a hidden space beneath the main staircase. Inside was a small wooden box containing several items: a child's doll, a woman's hairbrush, and a letter written by James Blackwood that had never been disclosed during the investigation. The letter, dated April 5, 1885, was addressed to a colleague in the church and revealed another dimension to the tragedy. Brother Thomas, I write to you in the strictest confidence regarding a troubling matter. My wife continues her secret adherence to the old practices her family brought from the continent. Worse, she is teaching these ways to Catherine. I discovered them yesterday engaged in some form of ritual involving candles and herbs. When confronted, Eleanor spoke of powers and energies that the church denies but cannot eliminate. She threatened to take Catherine and return to her family, where they would continue these practices openly. I cannot allow this corruption of an innocent child's soul. I have prayed for guidance, but hear only silence. I fear I must take matters into my own hands to save Catherine's soul, even if Eleanor cannot be redeemed. Please pray for us all. This discovery suggested that James Blackwood's actions, while unquestionably monstrous, may have been motivated by a twisted form of religious zealotry rather than simply possessiveness or fear of abandonment. This did nothing to absolve him of his crimes, but added another layer of complexity to the already disturbing case. The Historical Society opened the property to the public as the Blackwood Orchard Historical Site in 1980, offering guided tours that focused primarily on the agricultural history of the region, with only passing mention of the tragedy that had occurred there. However, the site gained a reputation among paranormal enthusiasts, who frequently reported unusual experiences, particularly near the north wall of the orchard. In the autumn of 1993, a group of researchers from Miskatonic University's Department of Folklore and Paranormal Studies conducted an overnight investigation at the site. Using what was then state-of-the-art recording equipment, they captured several anomalies, including temperature fluctuations, unexplained electromagnetic readings, and audio recordings of what appeared to be a woman's voice whispering the same phrase repeatedly: "Remember us, Doctor." Elizabeth Marsh, who led the investigation, noted in her report, "The Blackwood case represents a textbook example of what we term imprint haunting, the residual emotional energy of a traumatic event, leaving an impression on the physical environment." What makes this case unique is the apparent consciousness behind the manifestations. If these phenomena represent the spirits of Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood, they seem to be actively seeking acknowledgement and remembrance rather than merely replaying the circumstances of their deaths. The most compelling evidence collected by Dr. Marsh's team was a photograph taken near the north wall at exactly 3:17 a.m., the estimated time of death for Eleanor and Catherine based on the final entry in Eleanor's journal. The photograph appeared to show two transparent figures walking among the apple trees, holding hands, one tall, one small. Skeptics dismiss the image as a double exposure or camera malfunction, but those familiar with the case recognize the distinctive silhouettes of a woman in Victorian-era dress and a young girl in a pinafore. Throughout the years, visitors to the orchard have continued to report encounters with what locals now refer to as the Orchard Ladies. The most common experiences include the smell of apple blossoms out of season, the distant sound of singing, and the sensation of being gently touched by unseen hands. Children seem particularly receptive to these phenomena, often describing the sad mom and the little girl who can't find their way home. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from those who have touched the rebuilt North Wall. Many describe experiencing a momentary sensation of confinement, of air growing thin, of panic rising in their throats. Some claim to hear a voice whispering, "Don't forget us. As long as you remember, we're not trapped anymore." In 2003, nearly a century after the discovery of Eleanor and Catherine's remains, a descendant of James Blackwood visited the site. Michael Blackwood, James's great-grandson, had discovered the connection to his infamous ancestor while researching his family history. Troubled by what he learned, he felt compelled to visit the orchard and, in his words, make what amends I could for my family's sins. Michael brought with him 2 items, a modern locket containing a reproduction of Eleanor's portrait and a small porcelain doll similar to one Catherine might have owned. He placed these items in a niche in the north wall during a private ceremony, asking forgiveness for his great-grandfather's actions. That night, according to the caretaker of the property, the orchard bloomed out of season. Every tree suddenly covered in pale, fragrant blossoms that fell like snow in the moonlight. By morning, they were gone, but the air retained their sweet scent for days afterward. Since Michael Blackwood's visit, reports of paranormal activity at the orchard have changed in nature. Visitors no longer describe sensations of confinement or distress near the North Wall. Instead, there are accounts of a profound sense of peace, of benediction. Some claim to see the figures of a woman and child walking toward the eastern horizon, growing fainter with each step. The caretaker, who has worked at the site for over 20 years, offers perhaps the most poignant observation. They're not trapped anymore. They're just lingering, making sure we remember. And as long as we tell their story, they'll never truly be walled away again. The case of Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood remains one of the most documented hauntings in West Virginia history. Beyond the paranormal aspects, it stands as a stark reminder of the very human capacity for cruelty and the enduring power of the bond between mother and child, a love that, in this instance at least, appears to have transcended even death itself. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blackwood Orchard case is not what we know, but what remains unknown. In 2015, during a routine ground-penetrating radar survey of the property to assess the health of the tree roots, technicians discovered anomalies in the soil throughout the orchard, regularly spaced disturbances that could indicate multiple burial sites. Due to the historical significance of the property, no excavation has been approved. The current curator of the site, when asked about these findings, offers only a cryptic response. "We know James Blackwood walled away his wife and stepdaughter. We know he was troubled by what he saw as Eleanor's old country practices. What we don't know is whether Eleanor and Catherine were his only victims, or merely the ones we happened to find." The orchard continues to bear fruit each autumn. Locals will not eat the apples that grow there, claiming they taste too sweet, with an underlying bitterness that lingers long after the fruit is consumed. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows from the east, visitors to Elmwood sometimes report hearing faint voices carried on the breeze, a woman singing softly and a child laughing. Some say they are trying to warn us. Others believe they are simply reminding us not to forget. After all, as long as we remember, they're not trapped anymore. And the wall still stands, rebuilt but never quite the same. Those who place their hands against the cool stones of the north section often draw back quickly, unsettled by what feels like a faint answering pressure from the other side, as if something or someone is still there, waiting to be discovered, as if the horror of the Blackwood Orchard was never truly resolved at all. Remember as you go about your day that the walls around you hold their secrets close. What might they be concealing? What whispers might you hear if you pressed your ear against them? What faces might peer back at you from the other side if you dared to create an opening? Some mysteries are better left undisturbed. Others cry out for resolution, for remembrance. Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood found their resolution, their remembrance. But how many others remain forgotten, sealed away by those who wish them gone? Listen carefully tonight as you lie in bed. That soft tapping you hear might just be the settling of an old house, or it might be someone trying to reach you from behind the wall. Turn to God and Jesus Christ for protection against the evils that men do. For only through faith can we find the strength to face the darkness and remember those who have been forgotten. The Blackwood Orchard case became something of a local legend in Elmwood, but as decades passed, many dismissed it as mere folklore, a cautionary tale embellished over time. That changed in the autumn of 2018, when a young historian named Rebecca Harris arrived in town to research what she believed to be nothing more than a colorful piece of West Virginia history. Rebecca, a doctoral candidate from Georgetown University, had stumbled upon references to the Orchard Wall murders while researching religious conflicts in rural America at the turn of the 20th century. What began as a footnote in her dissertation soon became an obsession as she uncovered newspaper clippings, court records, and personal accounts that painted a disturbing picture of events that had been largely forgotten outside of Elmwood. I expected to find that much of the story had been exaggerated, Rebecca later wrote in her journal. What I discovered instead was that the public record had only captured a fraction of the horror. The true story of Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood was far more disturbing than the newspapers had reported, and it wasn't confined to that single incident in 1905. Rebecca took a room at the Elmwood Inn, a quaint establishment that had stood on Main Street since the late 1800s. The innkeeper, Martha Collins, was initially hesitant when Rebecca explained the purpose of her visit. "We don't much talk about the Blackwood business," Martha told her. "Some things are best left in the past, but I suppose if you're determined to dig it up, you should speak with Harold Jenkins. His grandmother was one of the maids at the Blackwood estate back then. If anyone knows the truth of it, it's Harold." Harold Jenkins, 87 years old and sharp as the autumn air, lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town. When Rebecca explained her research, he invited her inside without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for someone to ask. "I've been keeping my grandmother's stories alive for decades," Harold said, as he poured tea into delicate cups that seemed too fragile for his weathered hands. "But fewer folks want to hear them these days. They'd rather pretend it never happened, as if forgetting could somehow undo what was done." Harold's grandmother, Sarah Jenkins, had been 16 years old when she began working as a maid in the Blackwood household in 1883, 2 years before the disappearance of Eleanor and Catherine. According to Harold, Sarah had witnessed the gradual deterioration of the relationship between James Blackwood and his wife, driven by what she described as his growing religious fervor. Grandmother said Blackwood was always religious, but after joining a new congregation led by a preacher named Reverend Wade, he became obsessed with notions of sin and punishment, Harold explained. Eleanor Blackwood, being from German stock, practiced some old-world traditions, herbal remedies, seasonal celebrations, little rituals for protection, harmless things that her family had done for generations. But Blackwood and Reverend Wade saw these as pagan, as an affront to God. Sarah Jenkins had recorded her observations in a small diary that Harold had preserved. Rebecca was permitted to read these first-hand accounts, which revealed disturbing details absent from the official record. March 10th, 1885, one entry read, "Mr. Blackwood found Mrs. Eleanor's herb garden today and flew into a rage, calling it a witch's plot. He destroyed the entire garden while little Catherine watched, crying. Mrs. Eleanor tried to explain they were just medicines for winter colds, but he wouldn't listen. He made them both kneel in prayer for hours afterward. I brought them water when he finally left for his meeting." Another entry, dated just weeks before the disappearance. Mr. Blackwood has forbidden Mrs. Eleanor from speaking her mother tongue to Catherine. Says the German words might be spells or incantations. Mrs. Eleanor cried when she told me this, said her mother tongue was the only gift she had left to give her daughter. She whispers the words to Catherine at night now, teaching her in secret. The most chilling entry came from April 4th, 1885, just days before Eleanor and Catherine were sealed behind the wall. Reverend Wade visited today. He and Mr. Blackwood were closeted in the study for hours. I tried to listen, but could only catch a few words. Something about cleansing and salvation through containment. Mrs. Eleanor was frightened. She asked me if I could take a message to her cousin in Charleston. I agreed, but Mr. Blackwood has announced no one is to leave the property for the next week. He watches us all so closely now. Harold Jenkins had more to share beyond his grandmother's diary. He led Rebecca to a small shed behind his house, where he unlocked a weathered trunk containing items his grandmother had salvaged from the Blackwood estate after it was sold. Grandmother couldn't bear to see these things discarded, he explained, as he carefully lifted out a child's primer with the name Catherine, written in uneven script on the inside cover. She felt someone should remember them as they were, not just as victims. Among the items was a small leather-bound book of German folk remedies and traditions that had belonged to Eleanor, a pressed flower from Catherine's herbarium, and most significantly, a bundle of letters that Eleanor had written to her cousin in Charleston, but had never been able to send. The letters revealed that Eleanor's fears had extended beyond herself and Catherine. In one particularly disturbing passage she wrote, "I fear James has done this before. Last night in his sleep he spoke of the others who had to be contained. When I asked him this morning, he became agitated and denied saying anything. But there was something in his eyes, cousin. Something that makes me believe Catherine and I are not the first he has sought to save through his twisted methods." This suggestion that James Blackwood might have had other victims had never been part of the public record. Rebecca's research took on a new urgency as she began to investigate property records, looking for patterns in Blackwood's land acquisitions and construction projects. What she discovered sent a chill through the academic community. Prior to his marriage to Eleanor, James Blackwood had owned 2 other properties in neighboring counties. Both had been sold shortly after the deaths of his previous wife and her daughter from a first marriage. Both properties had undergone significant structural renovations under his ownership, including the construction of unusual walls or sealed rooms that were, according to the work orders, designed for storage or preservation. "The pattern is unmistakable," Rebecca wrote in her preliminary findings, which were published in the Journal of American History. James Blackwood appears to have been a serial killer who used architectural features to conceal his crimes, all under the guise of religious purification. The discovery of Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood in 1905 may have been merely the latest in a series of similar crimes spanning decades. Rebecca's research brought her inevitably to the Blackwood orchard itself, now maintained as a historic site, but seldom visited except by those with a specific interest in the macabre. The current caretaker, an elderly man named George Wilson, was initially reluctant to allow her access to areas not normally shown to visitors. "There are parts of this place that should be left undisturbed," he warned, "not out of respect for Blackwood, mind you, but for those he harmed. Some resting places shouldn't be disturbed, even in the name of history." But Rebecca was persistent, and eventually George agreed to show her the original foundation stones of the north wall, which had been preserved beneath the reconstructed version. It was there, examining the aged mortar and weathered stone, that Rebecca made a discovery that would change the narrative of the Blackwood case forever. Using ground-penetrating radar borrowed from Georgetown University's archaeology department, Rebecca detected anomalies not just in the north wall, but in all 4 walls surrounding the orchard. Further investigation revealed that the entire orchard was encircled by walls that contained sealed chambers similar to the one where Eleanor and Catherine had been found. "The implications are horrifying," Rebecca wrote in her journal that night. "If each of these chambers contained victims, the scale of Blackwood's crimes would be unprecedented. But who were these people, and why has no one discovered them until now?" The answer came from an unexpected source. As news of Rebecca's research spread through Elmwood, an elderly woman named Dorothy Mercer requested a meeting. Dorothy, 93 years old and confined to a nursing home on the edge of town, claimed to have information passed down through her family that had never been shared publicly. "My grandmother worked for the Blackwoods before Eleanor ever came to Elmwood," Dorothy explained in a quavering voice. "She was just a girl, 14 or 15, helping in the kitchen. She told me things that she never told another soul, not even my grandfather. Things about the harvest rituals, as James Blackwood called them." According to Dorothy's grandmother, James Blackwood had been part of a secret religious sect that had splintered from the mainstream church sometime in the 1860s. This group, led initially by Blackwood's father and later by Reverend Wade, believed that sin could be physically contained and separated from the righteous. They thought that by sealing away sinners in sacred ground, their souls would be purified over time, Dorothy explained. The apple orchard was their sacred ground. The trees absorbed the sin, transformed it into sweetness. That's why the apples were so sweet. They were nourished by the souls of the damned. This perversion of Christian doctrine had been practiced in secret for decades. James Blackwood had not acted alone, but had been part of a wider conspiracy that included prominent members of the community, including law enforcement officials and judges, who ensured that investigations never went too deep. "The wall chambers weren't just for family members who strayed," Dorothy continued. "They were for anyone the sect deemed in need of purification. Transients, outsiders, those who asked too many questions. They would be offered work at the orchard, then simply disappear. The official story was always that they had moved on, seeking opportunities elsewhere. No one looked too hard for itinerant workers who didn't return." Rebecca was skeptical of these claims until Dorothy produced a small leather diary that had belonged to her grandmother. The diary contained dates, names, and descriptions of people who had come to work at the Blackwood orchard and subsequently vanished. Next to each name was a notation indicating which section of the orchard wall they had been assigned to prepare, unwittingly digging what would become their own tombs. The sect believed the process worked best if the sinners participated in their own containment, Dorothy explained. There was a ritual to it. The victim would help build the chamber, making it strong and secure. Only when it was nearly complete would they be told its true purpose. Armed with this new information, Rebecca approached the county authorities with a request for a formal investigation of the Blackwood property. Her academic credentials, combined with the physical evidence from the ground-penetrating radar and the historical documentation she had gathered, were enough to convince them to proceed. In the spring of 2019, a team of forensic archaeologists began a careful examination of the orchard walls. The investigation had to balance the need for evidence with respect for the historical significance of the site and the potential human remains that might be discovered. The results confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. Over the course of 3 months, the team identified 27 distinct chambers within the orchard walls. Each was carefully opened and documented. 18 contained human remains in varying states of preservation. Based on clothing, personal effects, and subsequent identification through historical records, the victims spanned a period from approximately 1868 to 1885. The victims represent a cross-section of the vulnerable in late 19th century America, the official report stated. Immigrant laborers, unwed mothers, individuals with mental illnesses or developmental disabilities, and those who practiced religious or cultural traditions deemed foreign or pagan by the standards of Blackwood's sect. In each case, the individual appears to have been sealed into the chamber while still alive, with minimal provisions that would have sustained them for only a few days at most. The most disturbing discovery came from the western wall of the orchard. Unlike the other chambers, which contained individuals or sometimes pairs of victims, the western chamber held the remains of an entire family. A man, woman, and 3 children, ranging in age from approximately 2 to 10 years old. They were later identified as the Schmidt family, German immigrants who had come to work at the orchard in 1876 and had reportedly returned to the old country after a season's employment. Items found with the Schmidt family included a small wooden crucifix, prayer beads, and a child's doll with distinctly non-Protestant religious imagery, suggesting their Catholic faith may have been what marked them for purification in the eyes of Blackwood and his sect. As the investigation continued, researchers discovered a hidden root cellar beneath the orchard that had served as a meeting place for the sect. Inside were records kept by Reverend Wade, detailing the purification process and the theological justification for their actions. The documents revealed that the sect had called themselves the Husbandmen of Eden, believing their work was divinely ordained to cleanse the land of sin. The most chilling aspect of the documents was the clinical detachment with which they described the suffering of their victims. Reverend Wade had recorded observations of how long various individuals survived in their chambers, noting with scientific precision the effects of dehydration, starvation, and psychological distress. He described the process as the rendering of the soul from its sinful vessel and expressed satisfaction when victims spent their final hours in prayer or confession. For the community of Elmwood, the revelations were devastating. Many current residents were descendants of families who had lived in the area during Blackwood's time. Some were forced to confront the possibility that their ancestors had been either victims or complicit in the horrors of the orchard. The case attracted national attention. News crews descended on the small town, and the peaceful historic site became the center of what the media dubbed America's Forgotten Holocaust. Experts in cult psychology, religious history, and criminal pathology analyzed the case from every angle, trying to understand how such systematic evil could have remained hidden for so long. But for Rebecca Harris, the academic and historical aspects were secondary to the human tragedy that had unfolded within those walls. She worked closely with genealogists to identify living descendants of the victims, many of whom had never known the true fate of their ancestors. These weren't just historical curiosities or case studies, Rebecca said in an interview with the Washington Post. These were people with hopes and dreams, and families who mourned them. They deserved to be remembered as individuals, not just as victims of James Blackwood and his sect. In October of 2019, a memorial service was held at the orchard. Representatives from various faiths, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and practitioners of traditional European folk religions, offered prayers and blessings for the victims. The descendants of those who had been sealed in the walls placed flowers and personal mementos in the chambers where their ancestors had died. The remains of all the victims were eventually reinterred in the Elmwood Cemetery, with proper headstones bearing their names and, when known, the dates of their births and deaths. The simple epitaph, "Remembered at last," was engraved on each stone. The Blackwood orchard itself was deconsecrated and the land repurposed as a memorial garden, with 27 trees, one for each chamber, found in the walls, planted in a circle around a central monument that bears the names of all the identified victims. But even as the community attempted to make peace with its dark history, strange occurrences continued to be reported at the former orchard site. Workers dismantling the walls described hearing whispers and feeling cold spots that moved as if following them. Several reported dreams of people in 19th century clothing standing among the trees, watching them work. Most notably, when the chambers were opened, Workers and researchers found that in each one, small items had been arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns. Buttons formed into circles, twigs shaped into crude crosses, pebbles lined up in straight rows. These arrangements could not be explained by natural settling or decay. It was as if they were trying to communicate something, said Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the lead forensic archaeologist on the project. Or perhaps they were attempting to create protective symbols. Either way, it suggests the victims remained conscious and active long enough to create these patterns before succumbing to their imprisonment. The memorial garden thrived, the new trees growing with unusual vigor despite being planted in soil that had absorbed so much suffering. Visitors often comment on the profound sense of peace they feel there now, as if centuries of pain have finally found release. But on certain nights, particularly around the autumnal equinox, when many of the victims were sealed into their chambers, according to the sect's records, locals report seeing lights moving among the trees. Not flashlights or lanterns, but soft bluish glows that float a few feet above the ground, sometimes forming processions that wind through the former orchard before disappearing at dawn. Sound recordings made at the site during these nights have captured what audio analysts describe as layered voices, dozens of individuals speaking simultaneously in different languages, too faint to discern individual words, but creating a continuous murmur that rises and falls like breathing. Rebecca Harris completed her dissertation on the Blackwood case and the religious sect behind it, earning her doctorate with highest honors. In the course of her genealogical research, she discovered that her own great-great-grandmother had been one of the immigrant workers who had briefly been employed at the Blackwood Orchard in the summer of 1874, before supposedly returning to Ireland. No record of this ancestor's return to Ireland exists, and her name, Mary Sullivan, appears in Reverend Wade's ledger as having been received into the East Wall for purification on September 21st, 1874. She continues to study the psychological and sociological aspects of isolated religious communities and the potential for extremist beliefs to enable atrocities. But her connection to the Blackwood case extends beyond the academic. The East Wall chamber, identified as Mary's final resting place, contained the remains of a woman in her early 20s, along with a small silver claddagh ring that matched the description of a family heirloom long thought lost. "In a way, I was called here," Rebecca told the Elmwood Gazette in her final interview before leaving town. "Perhaps Mary's spirit somehow guided me to uncover the truth, not just for her, but for all of them. They waited so long to be found, to be remembered. The least we can do is ensure they're never forgotten again." The Blackwood case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how religious extremism, community complicity, and isolation can create the perfect conditions for evil to flourish undetected. It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural entities, but ordinary humans convinced of their own righteousness. As for the spirits of those sealed behind the walls, Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood, the Schmidt family, Mary Sullivan, and all the others whose names we now know, local legend holds that they no longer haunt the orchard. With proper remembrance and recognition of their suffering, they have found the peace that was denied them in life. But the trees still bear fruit each autumn, apples with flesh the deep red of arterial blood, and a sweetness that catches at the back of the throat. And sometimes, visitors who take a piece of fruit from the memorial garden report strange dreams, dreams of narrow spaces and dwindling light, of hands pressing against unyielding stone, of voices singing softly in different languages to comfort each other as the air grows thin. They say if you visit the garden at dusk and stand very still, you can sometimes hear the walls whispering, not in fear or anger, but in gentle warning. Remember us. Remember what was done here. Do not let it happen again. And in the town of Elmwood, they do remember, Every year on April 23rd, the day Thomas Miller discovered Eleanor and Catherine behind the wall, the townspeople gather in the Memorial Garden for a day of reflection and remembrance. They read aloud the names of the victims, share stories passed down through generations, and recommit themselves to vigilance against the kind of blind obedience and silent complicity that allowed the horrors of the Blackwood Orchard to continue for so long. The walls have been dismantled, the chambers opened, the dead given proper rest. But the memory remains, a scar on the landscape and the collective consciousness of the community. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying phrases in any language are not curses or threats, but the quiet justifications of those who believe their cruelty serves a higher purpose, for their own good, to save their souls. Because God commands it. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to the victims of the Blackwood Orchard comes not from official ceremonies or academic studies, but from the simple words carved into a bench in the Memorial Garden attributed to Eleanor. Blackwood's final journal entry: "Even in darkness we found light in each other. Even behind walls our souls remained free. Remember us not for how we died, but for how we lived, loving fiercely until the very end." And so we do remember them. Eleanor and Catherine holding hands in their final moments, the Schmidt children huddled close to their parents, Mary Sullivan arranging pebbles into the shape of her homeland's shores. All of them imprisoned by hate, but never truly contained by it. Their story reminds us that true evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that silence in the face of cruelty makes us complicit in its spread. It teaches us that no wall can truly contain the human spirit, and that remembrance is the most powerful weapon against those who would brick up the inconvenient, the different, the vulnerable. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, listening to the settling of your home around you, take a moment to remember those who were sealed away. Listen for their whispers, not in fear, but in solidarity. And if you hear something behind your walls, a tap, a scratch, a distant voice, perhaps it is not a haunting, but a reminder. Some horrors are not supernatural, but entirely human in origin. Some monsters are made, not born, and the greatest protection against them is not crosses or prayers, but the courage to see clearly, speak loudly, and remember faithfully. For as Eleanor wrote, as long as someone remembers us, we are not truly gone. As long as someone tells our story, the walls cannot hold us. And so their story has been told, and the walls no longer hold them. But the orchard remains, and the trees still bear fruit. And in Elmwood they say that to eat an apple from those trees is to take within yourself a piece of those lost souls, not in corruption but in communion, a sharing of memory and a promise to remain vigilant. For what is remembrance if not a form of resurrection? What is storytelling if not a way of keeping the dead alive? And what are walls, in the end, but temporary barriers that will eventually crumble before the persistence of truth? Remember them. Remember the orchard ladies and all those who suffered with them, and in remembering, ensure that such walls are never built again. For only through faith in God and the teachings of Jesus Christ can we find the strength to face such darkness without becoming lost in it ourselves. Only through divine love can we hope to counter the kind of twisted faith that builds walls instead of bridges, that contains instead of liberates, that punishes instead of forgives. In the words inscribed on the central monument in what was once the Blackwood Orchard, for those who were walled away but never truly contained, for those who were forgotten but are now remembered, for those who were silenced but now speak through us, may they rest in peace, and may we never rest in complacency. The disturbing case of the mother and daughter behind the bricked orchard wall was indeed resolved, but the resolution brought not an end, but a beginning of remembrance, of vigilance, and of the long process of healing that follows when long-buried truths finally emerge into the light. And in that light, even the darkest walls cannot stand.